There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1945. Eisenhower stands at the center of the frame, flanked by generals, smiling. Behind them, the broken remnants of what was once Germany's last organized defensive wall in the West. The caption beneath the photograph, in press releases distributed to every major American newspaper, credits the Allied Supreme Commander and his broad front strategy with finally cracking the Siegfried Line. The man who actually did it is not in the photograph. His name does not appear in the caption. His corps, which had driven through terrain that 3 other units had attempted and failed to penetrate, received a single paragraph in the official Army communiqué. And in Eisenhower's published memoirs, his contribution is described in 11 words before the narrative moves on to someone more politically convenient. What you are about to hear is not a story about a battle. It is a story about how armies decide who matters and what happens to the men who matter most when that decision is made by someone sitting far from the fighting. The Siegfried Line was not built to be breached, it was built to be believed in. When German engineers began construction in 1938, the strategic logic was simple and total. Create a defensive barrier so formidable, so deeply layered, so psychologically overwhelming that no Western army would seriously attempt to break it. The result was 18,000 individual fortifications stretching from the Swiss border to the Dutch coast. Concrete pillboxes with walls 4 feet thick, dragon's teeth obstacles designed specifically to stop Allied armor, underground command bunkers that could absorb a direct hit from medium artillery and continue functioning. By the summer of 1944, Allied planners understood the mathematics of what they were facing. Every study, every intelligence estimate, every engineering assessment said the same thing. A frontal assault on the Siegfried Line without a prolonged, systematic preparation would be catastrophically expensive. The official expectation at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was that penetrating the West Wall in force would require weeks of preparation, overwhelming air support, and the coordination of multiple army groups attacking simultaneously. That was the official expectation. The reality that developed on the ground in early 1945 was something no staff officer in London or Versailles had anticipated. Because wars have a way of producing men who solve problems that official doctrine declares unsolvable. The question is never whether those men exist. The question is whether the institution they serve is willing to acknowledge them after the fact. Lawton Collins was not supposed to be the man who broke Germany's last line. The system had not written that part for him. He was aggressive, dangerously, almost recklessly aggressive by the standards of a command culture that valued caution, coordination, and controlled advance. He had earned the nickname Lightning Joe on Guadalcanal, where his handling of the 25th Infantry Division demonstrated a willingness to accept tactical risk that his superiors found alternately inspiring and alarming. In the European theater, Collins commanded the 7th Corps under Bradley's First Army. He had fought at Utah Beach, at Cherbourg, through the Hurtgen Forest, and across the frozen roads of the Ardennes. His corps had the best sustained combat record of any unit on the Western Front. His subordinate commanders knew what was expected of them, and what was expected was speed, aggression, and the exploitation of every gap before the enemy could seal it. The official doctrine of corps-level advance required methodical coordination. You secured your left flank. You ensured your right flank was covered by the adjacent corps. You reported your positions to Army headquarters, waited for confirmation, and then moved. The reason for this doctrine was sound.
In a theater operating at the scale of World War II, a rogue advance could expose the entire army group to encirclement. The system existed to prevent individual brilliance from becoming collective disaster. What the system had not accounted for was an enemy that had nothing left. By February 1945, the Wehrmacht formations defending the Siegfried Line were a shadow of what they had been. Divisions that had once fielded 15,000 men now mustered 3,000 or 4,000. Supply lines were severed. Ammunition was rationed by the shell. The men holding the bunkers were not the veterans of 1940. They were teenagers and men in their 50s, holding positions designed for fully equipped combat formations, with rifles and very little else. Collins understood what this meant before his superiors did.
In early February 1945, Collins received a series of patrol reports from his forward units that told a story radically different from the picture being painted at Army headquarters. The Siegfried Line in his sector, a stretch of fortifications near the Ruhr River that had been assessed as among the most formidable on the entire front, was, in the estimation of the men who had actually crawled up to its wire and watched it through the darkness, beginning to come apart. The garrison troops were demoralized. In some positions, they were not rotating out sentries properly. Supply convoys were not arriving on schedule. There were gaps in the defensive line where previously there had been none because there were simply no longer enough men to fill them. Collins compiled this intelligence and forwarded it to First Army headquarters with a recommendation: authorize an immediate, full-weight assault before the Germans could consolidate their remaining forces. The official response was measured, cautious. Additional preparation was needed. Additional coordination was required with adjacent corps. The broader strategic picture had to be considered. What would you choose if you were the man on the ground, if you could see the gap closing in real time and the permission you needed was sitting on a desk 50 miles to the rear? Collins chose to push hard, and within the limits of his authority, he began positioning his corps for an attack that his superiors had not yet formally authorized. On the 23rd of February 1945, following the dropping of the Ruhr River flood levels that had stalled the offensive for 2 critical weeks, Collins launched 7th Corps across the river and directly into the fortified heart of the Siegfried Line. The attack was not a probe, it was not a reconnaissance in force, it was a full corps assault designed to break through before the enemy could react, and it hit with the kind of velocity that the German defenders, already stretched to breaking point, could not absorb. The official military doctrine for breaching a prepared defensive line called for a systematic approach. Artillery preparation lasting hours, engineers moving forward to clear obstacles under covering fire, infantry following in waves, consolidating each position before the next advance, step by measured step. Collins did something different. He compressed the timeline to a degree that bordered on reckless by conventional standards. Artillery was intense but brief. Engineers moved forward in direct coordination with the leading infantry rather than behind them. Armored elements were pushed forward faster than doctrine prescribed. The intent was not to clear the Siegfried Line methodically. The intent was to collapse it psychologically, to move through it so fast that the defenders never had time to organize a coherent response. It worked. Within 48 hours, 7th Corps had penetrated the west wall in 3 separate places. Within a week, Collins had punched a hole in Germany's last prepared defensive line, wide enough to drive an entire army through. The fortifications that had been expected to hold for weeks fell in days. Not because the plan was perfect, not because nothing went wrong, but because the man commanding understood that windows of opportunity in warfare are measured in hours, and that the cost of caution in that moment was greater than the cost of boldness.
If you have made it this far, what comes next is the part that has been absent from most accounts you will have encountered. Because what happened after Collins broke the Siegfried Line reveals something about military institutions that the official histories are structurally unable to admit. The breakthrough needed to be explained to the American public. It needed a narrative. It needed a face. And the face the Allied command chose was not the face of the man who had ordered the assault. Eisenhower held a press conference in which the collapse of the West Wall was framed as the inevitable result of Allied strategic pressure along the entire front, the broad front strategy that Eisenhower himself had championed against the objections of commanders like Patton and Montgomery, who had argued for a concentrated thrust. The narrative was carefully constructed. The line had not been broken by one aggressive corps commander acting on instinct and forward intelligence. It had been ground down by the relentless pressure of the entire Allied force, and it was the Supreme Commander's vision that had made that pressure possible. There was enough truth in that framing to make it defensible. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had indeed kept German forces stretched across hundreds of miles of front. It had prevented the Wehrmacht from concentrating against any single thrust. Those were real strategic achievements. But they were not what broke the Siegfried Line on the 23rd of February. What broke it was one corps, one commander, and a decision made without waiting for permission.
Collins knew the rules. He had grown up inside the institution. He understood how credit was allocated, how narratives were constructed, and what happened to officers who publicly contested the official account of events. He had watched what happened to Patton, who could not stop himself from saying what he believed regardless of consequence. He had watched what happened to Terry Allen, who had been the finest division commander in the theater and had been relieved for not fitting the institutional mold. Collins fit the mold, mostly. He was aggressive, but he was also disciplined. He understood where the lines were, and so he did what the institution trained its best officers to do. He filed his reports, received his decorations through proper channels, and did not publicly contest the narrative being constructed above him. The cost of that silence was not paid by Collins. It was paid by history, because the lesson that the official account enshrined, that broad strategic pressure patiently applied had broken the Siegfried Line, was the wrong lesson. The correct lesson was that aggressive commanders, given latitude to act on ground-level intelligence, can collapse defenses that methodical approaches would have taken weeks longer to penetrate. That lesson, if learned, might have changed how the American military prepared for the next war. It was not learned, because the man who embodied it was not mentioned in the photograph. There is a body of evidence that the official American histories treated as peripheral, but that is, in retrospect, among the most revealing documentation of what actually happened in February 1945. German after-action reports from the units defending the West Wall sector that Collins breached describe the assault with a consistency that is striking. The speed of the American advance was cited in multiple reports as the decisive factor. German commanders wrote that they had expected time to move reserves into the breach. They had expected the standard American operational pause, the period of consolidation that previous experience had taught them to anticipate between a breakthrough and the exploitation that followed. That pause did not come. When the reserves arrived, they arrived to find the Americans already 2 miles beyond the position they had been sent to reinforce. The psychological effect on the German units was described in the reports as severe. Troops who had been prepared to fight for weeks lost their confidence within days because the pace of the advance communicated something that the actual casualties did not, that the enemy's collapse was not merely tactical, it was systemic. The enemy had understood the significance of what Collins had done more clearly than the headquarters that denied him credit for it. The officers who served under Collins during the Siegfried Line breakthrough left a record. It is scattered across memoirs, after-action interviews, and private correspondence that military historians have assembled over the decades since the war. The picture that emerges from that record is consistent. They knew what had happened. They knew who had made the decisions, and most of them, for the duration of their careers, said nothing publicly that contradicted the official account. Not because they were dishonest men, because they understood the system they were operating inside, and they understood that the system did not reward the kind of honesty that costed a useful narrative. One officer, writing privately to a colleague years after the war, described watching Collins receive a decoration that acknowledged his Corps' role in the breakthrough in terms he considered deliberately minimizing. He wrote that he had stood at attention during the ceremony and felt something that he could not quite name. Not anger, something quieter and more lasting than anger. He called it the recognition of how things actually work.
History is not made in the moments that matter. It is made in the moments afterward, when institutions decide which version of events serves their interests and assemble the documentation to support that version. Eisenhower was not dishonest in any simple sense. He was an institution, and institutions do not credit individuals when crediting the system is available as an alternative. The broad front strategy was Eisenhower's. The Siegfried Line fell on Eisenhower's watch. In the logic of command authority, the supreme commander bears responsibility for failures and therefore receives credit for successes. That logic is not without validity. An army group does not fight as a collection of independent actors. The conditions that made Collins' assault possible, the sustained pressure that had degraded German reserves, the logistical infrastructure that kept 7th Corps supplied, the strategic decisions that had positioned the force, those were real contributions made by people who were not in the forward trenches. But there is a difference between acknowledging a system and erasing the man within it who made the decisive move. And that difference matters because it determines what the institution learns. A system that credits strategy for tactical successes will invest in strategy. A system that credits the bold decision of the ground-level commander will invest in producing and protecting commanders capable of bold decisions. One of those systems wins wars faster. One of them produces fewer casualties. And you already know which is which.
The Siegfried Line fell in February 1945. Germany surrendered in May. The war in Europe was over in 93 days from the moment Collins' Corps crossed the Ruhr. In the years that followed, the official history of that breach was written by men with institutional interests. The memoirs were published, the photographs were captioned, the narratives were set in the kind of concrete that is harder to break than anything the German engineers built along the West Wall. Collins lived until 1987. He was decorated, he was respected, he rose to become Army Chief of Staff. By any measure, his career was a success, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this story. Because the injustice here was not the kind that destroys a man, it was the kind that simply erases a truth. And erasures of that kind do not announce themselves. They settle quietly into the record, and after enough time has passed, they become indistinguishable from what actually happened. There is a word for what Collins did in February 1945. It is not a word that appears in the official histories. It is not in the press releases, or the captioned photographs, or the memoir chapters that Eisenhower devoted to the campaign. The word is decisive. Not strategic, not methodical, not the product of sustained pressure patiently applied along a broad front. Decisive. One man, one corps, one window of time that was closing, and the understanding that waiting for permission was itself a choice, with consequences measured not in careers, but in lives. The question that history never answers, and that every commander in every war must answer for themselves, is this. When the moment comes and the permission has not arrived, when you can see what needs to be done and the people with the authority to authorize it cannot yet see what you see, what do you do? Collins answered that question in February 1945.
The institution that benefited from his answer decided he had not asked it. That is how history is written. That is who writes it. And that is why the photograph hangs the way it does. Eisenhower at the center, the broken wall behind him, and somewhere off the frame, the man who actually broke it, standing just out of the light.